Sarah, thank you for doing it.
Thank you for having me.
You have an unusual role as a law professor. First-year students are accustomed to professors in a certain context in front of a classroom and so on. Most of your teaching is not that. You are a clinical teacher, at the same time you are, with your students, an appellate advocate for people who have been convicted of crimes. And frequently these are horrendous, terrible crimes that they have been convicted of. What is there about your background or your upbringing that led you to that kind of work, both the teaching aspect and representing people who have maybe done, certainly been convicted of doing terrible things?
It was not a linear path. Some of you probably knew you wanted to be lawyers at age 2 and you were on track to be here all your lives. I really didn't plan to go to law school. And when I went to law school, I wanted to do international human rights work. That's why I chose Emory. I was not very politically aware or socially aware about the problems that I'm working with now. And I learned about those problems in law school. I got a job because I needed money, not because I was really, offended about what happens in criminal courts in Georgia. But I needed $10 an hour. I think that's what I made working through law school. And then slowly what I learned informed my concern, my outrage, and wanting to do something about it. I got better at it because I did a lot of the work. And because I was doing some of the work was paid for by the public defender office, but this is kind of technical, but in Georgia there's no right to counsel in habeas corpus petitions. We're one of 2 states in the country that doesn't provide counsel in habeas corpus. We're hanging out with Alabama, which is not surprising. And Georgia doesn't even provide counsel in death penalty cases in habeas corpus. And so I started working with student volunteers from Emory Law School doing habeas appeals in the Georgia Supreme Court, even though I was a salaried public defender. So I couldn't spend salary time on that. So I started working with students. And then that turned into a class that I taught at Emory. And then, you guys don't know this, but I'm from Macon. And by this time in my career, by the time I was working at Emory, I had 2 boys, and my mom, who's a retired nurse, was like lobbying me to bring the grandchildren home. So a friend of hers from Sunday school gave her a job posting from Mercer Law School that said, we're looking for law professors, and I thought it was to teach contracts, and I thought, oh, that'd be horrible. And it was to help start the Law and Public Service program, which is a dream job. And of course I would try for that job, and I was hired and felt very excited to be here. And so I think it's a lot of good fortune, really, but kind of an accumulation of experiences along the way.
Yeah, I know you've told me the story that in this process of making this commitment to this kind of work, there was a moment when you encountered Brian Stevenson.
Right.
As you know, the students are reading Just Mercy, and we'll be discussing it in class in a few weeks. Could you tell that story?
Sure.
And what effect it had on you?
Sure. Actually, I was already committed to doing public service work. By the time I went to, I was working on death row in California, actually, when I met Brian Stevenson. This is in 2001. And has anyone spent any time in the Bay Area? To me, it's the promised land, right? I mean, I was kind of, let's say, I'm fairly liberal here in Georgia and kind of used to that, sticking out a little bit in that way. And everyone like recycles and drinks good coffee in San Francisco. I thought, I found my tribe. I belong in San Francisco. And Brian Stevenson came and talked to a group of death penalty lawyers in San Francisco. I had a job offer, which is also, we got job offers in our 3rd years of law school back in 2001. But he was talking about just the horrors of the work of doing death penalty work in Georgia and Alabama. And I said, oh God, I've got to go back to Georgia. And that's my moment with Brian Stevenson, as you know, is a very compelling person. He's a compelling writer, even more compelling in person. And the truth is, there's a great need for this work in California. California has the nation's largest death row, but they pay lawyers to do that work. They pay them well. And here, I saw a need, so I came back.
Well, if law wasn't the goal all along, I'm curious what it was. I know one of your degrees is in theology. Was that a career path that you considered?
It really never was. I hated law school so much my first year that I read a pamphlet about the law and religion program, and my friends, I had friends in the theology school at Candler. Emory's a different place than Mercer Law School, by the way, I'll say. And there were good things about it, but it was very large and really impersonal and very pre-corporate, and I probably chose the wrong law school for me, honestly. But Candler was exactly all the things that I loved about being an undergraduate at Mercer, because I went to Mercer as an undergrad. Small classes, lots of kind of interesting dialogue, connections with faculty, ethic of service. And so I got a degree in theology, not because I ever really wanted to be a theologian. I'm really not. I was fascinated by the topic, and Candler had good financial aid, but really because I just couldn't imagine taking a full law school semester of classes ever again. So after my first year, I split my time between the theology school and the law school for the next 3 years, which was amazing. So I wanted to be a musician. That didn't work out.
Well, for those who don't know, you do have a musical career on the side with Sue and the Bastards.
Right.
Sue in, like Ann is in Ann.
Right. Yeah. Chris Wells points out that most of us have experience defending the Bastards, but that's the name of our band.
Yeah. This is a personal question, I got a couple of personal questions, but you knew I was going to ask them, and wouldn't ask them without permission. What role does your religious faith play in what you do as a lawyer?
Right. This is probably not a surprise to you guys because you've heard enough about my journeys. I've struggled with the role of faith in my life, and at the time I was in law school, and actually the time I was in theology school, I was not a person of faith, even though I was raised in a Christian tradition. But when I was working on death row, I met a lot of men who were confronting their mortality, and I came to think of religion not as a kind of cynical, divisive influence in people's lives, but as really a source of solace and a source of hope. And so I'd say beginning with that work and then continuing really through my cases, I would say the theology that speaks to me most is a theology of grace, that nobody's perfect, but that there are opportunities for us to show grace for others, especially if we consider ourselves people who have received grace in our own lives. And so, especially with one case in particular that I'm working on, I've really been touched and moved and motivated by that worldview of showing kindness and really just very motivated by an opportunity to show grace as we've received it.
The other personal question I want to ask you with your children in the room is, I know your boys, and I know that they are a huge part of your life, the most important thing in your life, I suspect. But you also do all of this, and you're very active in the community. How on earth do you do all of it?
That's a good question. I'm busier than I want to be. I'm actually on sabbatical right now, but I'm failing sabbatical because we have a bunch of major court deadlines in the clinic, and so I'm not at a house in England that we'd arranged to live in, and drink tea and read Wordsworth. So we're here and working. So I don't sleep a lot. That's one thing. And one thing is I'm just motivated by a lot of things, and of course the boys are the most important. But they've been good sports. They're kind of along for the ride for a lot of the stuff.
Literally,
So
they're here.
they're literally here. I bring them along to conferences, and we, find ways to make those vacations and things. So I think I'm pretty good at the working vacation, and they're great. They're great sports, but they are the most important thing to me. So you're right about that.
Knowing you, I know that working with your students is a very important thing to you, and we have some of your best students with us this morning. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why this is so important to you. I mean, you work intensively with a relatively small number of students. Could you talk about that and why that is so central to what you do?
So I teach 2 clinics. Well, right now I'm not teaching anything, but normally I teach the Public Defender Clinic and the Habeas Project Clinic. There's 13 in the Public Defender Clinic, and right now there's 7 in the Habeas Clinic. And that's kind of our legal education's industry standard, that you really can't have deep experiential learning in a class of this size. You can have deep transformative learning on theories and big ideas, but Professor Longden couldn't possibly edit your motion to suppress and file it on time with this many people in class. So I work very closely with a small number of students, and as I'm sure they could tell you, we work really intensely on drafting, strategizing, agonizing over the themes we're going to pursue in our cases, themes we're not going to pursue in our cases. We sit around the table in, I think they call the classroom the fishbowl. It's upstairs. That's the only classroom I teach in, other than client counseling. And we operate as really a small law firm. But the class couldn't be a lot bigger because then we couldn't work together in the same way. So that's why the classes are small. They're intentionally small. I think there's no rule about it, but the faculty has decided that the clinical classes should be small because of the nature of the work we're doing. And I think sometimes, gosh, if we had 16 students in the Habeas Clinic, we could take 3 times the number of cases and help 3 times the number of clients, and that's attractive, but not in the end the right way to teach. And of course, we have 2 goals in the clinic, and one of the goals is to represent our clients and represent them well, but the primary goal is teaching, and so I want to help. I try to teach good habits, and so we could handle more cases in theory, but we want the learning to be in the right way.
Speaking of your clients, you and your team, your little law firm, represent people who've been convicted of murder, probably a lot of other horrendous crimes. I suspect many of them are actually factually guilty of the acts that led to their convictions. How do you represent people who have done horrible things?
That's a really good question. That's probably the most frequent question I get about doing criminal defense work. First of all, I got interested because the legal issues to me are fascinating in criminal law, more fascinating than in any other field. And the beauty of law practice is there are so many different law fields. You will find the law field that turns you on, that fascinates you. And so academically and intellectually, criminal law is the draw. And so, but then in criminal law you can choose to be a prosecutor or a defense attorney. And working as an intern in law school for the public defender office in Atlanta, always doing appellate work. I really have done very little trial work. I saw the awesome power of the state wielded against poor people, intellectually disabled people, children, and yes, they had done horrible things, but in a public defender's office, you're only representing people who fall well below the poverty line. I was representing children who were going to go to jail for a long period of time for even the accusations I thought were specious, even if they were guilty of them. I don't believe it was behavior for which people should be incarcerated. I saw the all of the resources of the state, investigatory, prosecution, the judge asking to be convinced that the client was innocent, which was confusing. And I thought, well, I want to stand, if I can stand on either side, and I would rather stand with the poor person or the child or the poor child who had been accused, no matter what they had done. That it's an obligation in my family tradition to help where we're able. I don't come from a family of lawyers, but I come from a family of public servants and helpers. And so I was already kind of drawn to career paths that would include helping others. But you see the machinery of the state cranking up against a bunch of inmates lined up in orange jumpsuits, pleading guilty, waiving their rights en masse. This is not unconstitutional in Georgia, to waive your constitutional rights all at once, and then the transcript says, and all defendants nodded. No matter what they've done, and of course I have a heart for their victims, especially if the crimes were violent crimes. It doesn't mean I don't care about their victims or their victims' families, but the people that I want to work for are the people who have no one else to speak for them, literally.
Where do your clients come from? How do they reach you? And I know more want you to represent them than you could possibly hope to represent. So how do they get to your door, and how do you decide who gets to come in?
It's actually gotten a lot easier. Saying no is really hard for me because I can usually find something about a case that went wrong if I look at it enough. When I first came here, we were getting cases out of, by referral from other attorneys who took a case to a certain point, but then were not allowed to take it any farther. So a public defender can do a trial and an appeal, but then beyond that, they can't do habeas. We were getting letters from moms, phone calls from moms begging for help for their children, and we were getting lots of jail mail, and I was trying to go through and take cases out of the jail mail. As you can imagine, that's not really efficient. We get probably 50 letters a week at least asking for help, and then you have to vet those cases and find the records and find the witnesses, and so that wasn't really efficient. Since we started that project at Emory, I've handled most of the cases without counsel, criminal cases without counsel in the Georgia Supreme Court. And so over the years, that's grown. We're essentially the public defender for the Georgia Supreme Court. It's not an official relationship, but I have a relationship with the clerk, who's a Mercer Law School grad. And she asks us if we're interested. We don't get paid. We're not obligated. And of course, they could reach out to other attorneys, but they reach out to us because they know the students' work is really very fine, and that I am interested in these cases. And so right now, we have one case that we got in a special way that I imagine we'll talk about in a minute, and then we take all of the pro se cases in the Supreme Court, which turns out to be it's normally about 5 cases a year, which is a lot for an appellate clinic. I think we're the busiest appellate clinic in any law school in the country.
What's it like to tell one of those moms no?
Oh, it's awful. It's awful. I'll be honest, I screen my calls in the office because there are days when I'm not in a space to say no to a mom, and then sometimes I just say yes. But one of my most interesting and biggest success story cases, a mom called me at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and said, "I need a lawyer for a habeas corpus." And she and her son were Sudanese, and they were legal residents but not citizens. Her teenage son had gotten caught with one joint in a glove compartment. He consented to a search, pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor, never spent the night in jail. His lawyer pleaded him guilty to this misdemeanor probation. But no one ever thought to ask whether this young man was a U.S. citizen. And not his lawyer, not the prosecutor, or the solicitor, not the judge. And he pleaded guilty to 1 year of probation. Well, the way that our immigration and deportation laws are written, if someone pleads guilty to a sentence that's a year or greater, depending on what it is, it's deportable. And so he was a straight-A student, never been in trouble. It was not even clear that it was his marijuana cigarette, but because he pleaded guilty, he was going to be deported to the Sudan. Do you guys know what's happening in Sudan in 2007? This is like a death sentence. He had no family there anymore. And so we worked it out with the solicitor. The solicitor agreed that that was not the result that she intended when she offered a 1-year plea. The judge vacated the conviction. We pleaded him guilty to 11 months and 28 days. And now he's a U.S. citizen and an engineer. And so I remember that story when I feel like I have to say no, because I didn't know what she was going to ask me or how it was going to turn out when we started the conversation. And the headline could read, convicted drug user deported, and a lot of people would say, yes, that's the right result. And if you scratch beneath the surface of that headline, he lived his whole life in the United States. He was an honor student. He's contributing to our community in really powerful ways, and so maybe I'll stop there.
Without the right lawyer, he would have been deported.
Oh yes, there's no doubt. There's no right to counsel in habeas, and he did need a habeas petition, and there's no right to counsel in those immigration proceedings. So he would have been deported, and unless something miraculous had happened, he might not be alive, much less a U.S. citizen.
I want you to notice I asked you a question about saying no when you told a story about saying yes. Just for the record.
No. I do have to say no a lot to prison mail, and I make my students do it. No, we all say no together.
I suspect some of your clients are difficult in one way or another. Could you talk a little bit about that? In what ways are they difficult, and how do you deal with difficult clients?
Right. I've actually only had one client who I would consider to be difficult. A lot of times people don't trust me when I first take the case, and one of the things I really like and that I think our clinic is really good at is building trust where we think there's no possibility of trust, where the client's telling us what they think we should do, or second guessing us, or expressing their concern, and everyone, the front row is laughing because we get these letters from our clients and they know that we're the lawyers, but they just don't trust us because they've got lots of reasons not to trust lawyers. I've had one client who really was a difficult client, but he did have mental health issues. He eventually fired me. I was the 11th lawyer he'd fired, and actually he had an interesting claim that no one had pursued, and he wrote me an apology letter a year later and said, everything you said would happen, my case is still hung up in the court. He thought we were taking too long with the case, and I was trying to explain that there are just things that we had to do to, kind of develop his claim, and he apologized, and at that point I couldn't take the case back on and all of that. But, you know, for people who've been convicted of difficult crimes or violent crimes, and many of whom are, you know, factually innocent of that, of those acts, again, whether they're legally, I mean, factually guilty of those acts, whether they're legally guilty is is another question. Our clients are funny, warm, appreciative. I've always said this is prophetic. The year before I got pregnant with Dean, I got a bunch of Mother's Day cards from clients. I was not a mother, but they sent me Mother's Day cards from clients from prison thanking me and said I was, you know, as good to them as their mother or something, maybe better, hopefully better. I really like our clients an awful lot, and they're by and large warm and wonderful, three-dimensional, kind people who have, you know, gotten caught on the worst day of their lives, and sometimes the worst day of their lives wasn't even hurting anybody. So.
Are there particular clients or cases that stand out in your mind?
Well, the case I told you about, that stands out. I've had one case where we all really believed our client was actually innocent and serving a life sentence for murder. That case, you know, haunts me. I can't wait till she's parole eligible and we can work on a parole petition for her. This is a really good story. We had a case a few years ago where a young woman had been convicted at 17 of, do you guys remember when Lisa Left Eye Lopez set fire to her cheating boyfriend's tennis shoes, right? So she did something similar. As a pregnant 17-year-old, she torched the new house of her current boyfriend's new girlfriend. And the current boyfriend was a drug dealer and abusive and all of this, but when she found herself pregnant at 17, he took up with another woman. And no one was hurt, the house burned down. And she went to prison for 5 years, and she gave birth in shackles and went to prison for 5 years. So,
and you do mean literally in shackles at the time of birth?
Yes.
That happens.
Oh, yes. So, yes. She had some contact in the first year with her child while she was still in the county jail, but had not had a lot of contact with her child. Visitation and letters and all of that. So we got her out of prison. We tried to do something about her $500 a month restitution to the insurance company. That's still an ongoing question. That was more than my monthly student loan payment coming out of law school. And she, you know, I think she had a GED. I think she got a GED in prison. And you know, restitution to an insurance company is always, I feel like the insurance has already been taken care of by the premiums. But anyway, we got her out of prison, and then we helped reunite her with her child. And we worked with a volunteer lawyer from King and Spalding, who always wanted to do what we're doing, but for some practical reasons has been working at a large firm. And this was a life-changing moment for our pro bono colleague. It was a life-changing moment for me when her son leapt off the front porch of his grandmother's, who he'd been living with, and said, "Mommy," and they hugged, and you know, we're reunited. And so that I'll never forget that. That's a definite high for me. But honestly, if we had longer, there's something special about all my clients. I really have enjoyed all of them. So.
Well, you mentioned loans, student loans, right? There are probably students in here this morning who are interested in what you do, but realize that they will have student loans to pay back, and are wondering how you afford to do what you do. What would you say to them if they were concerned about that? I'd love to do this noble work, but I have to pay back the money.
Well, there are a couple things. One is that there is student loan repayment assistance if you're doing public service work, right? So there's income-based repayment, so that in theory, and more recent grads could probably tell you how this works practically, but your monthly payments get right-sized according to your monthly income, and that after 10 years of public service, whether that's being a public school teacher or a prosecutor or a police officer or a defense attorney, those are forgiven. I think we're coming up on 10 years of the passage of that bill, so we'll see how that all works out and the tax implications and all of that. I did graduate with loans. I didn't graduate with as much debt as many of my colleagues did, so I've made hard financial decisions, but not as hard as other people. There are ways, if being a public defender or a legal services attorney is just absolutely not in the cards for you, that there are ways to help through pro bono service. But if your heart is to do this work, there are ways to make it happen. Legal services, Georgia Legal Services and other legal services offices offer loan repayment assistance as part of their benefits package. And you do spend most of your waking hours at your work with your colleagues, and it's really important to try to find the right fit. And if you're not driven and passionate about your work, whatever that is, if you don't want to be a public defender, don't feel guilty about it. There are ways to contribute, but if what your heart is to do this kind of work, there are ways to make it happen, and there is support there, but it doesn't mean that it's easy. And I don't know if you've seen the HBO documentary Gideon's Army, and there's a lawyer counting change in her wallet to try to get gas at the end of the month. I've definitely been there, and you think, oh, I'm a lawyer, I'm supposed to be fancier than this. And but that gets better. You get raises, and at the end of the day, the work is really, really, it's very satisfying, and it's fascinating.
Right now, you're working on a particular case that has some particular importance to you. All your clients are important, but I want you to talk about this one client and what's happening right now, and what you have been able to do for him, and what you are trying to do for him now.
So, in To Kill a Mockingbird, there's a scene with Atticus and Scout where Atticus says, at some point, for every lawyer, a case comes along and you feel like this is your case. And I think I'm getting kind of mystical in my, at this age, whatever age I am.
30s.
I'm in my 30s. I think this case I'm working on is the whole reason why I'm a lawyer. I can't tell you how important it is to me. I'll back up and tell you a little bit the background of the case. I grew up in West Virginia. We moved to Macon when I was in 3rd grade, and then at some point skipped 4th grade and was already kind of a nerd to begin with. And I had big pink glasses, and my mom was really strict, and she wouldn't let us wear blue jeans to school, so I couldn't watch scary movies. I was definitely not bullied, but let's say a social pariah in 6th grade. So there, I went to public school here in town, and the school that I went to was also the school that children from a children's home came to. And I remember, I don't know if you guys have lots of memories from 6th grade. I have some memories of 6th grade of, having to run around the track when I didn't want to, and being stressed out about spelling tests, and other memories of being excluded from kind of a mean girl clique in 6th grade, as mean as that could have been, and of a young classmate kind of sticking up for me. So I said starting in my first year of law school, I worked in a public defender's office, and there's a database online that you guys can go to. The Georgia Department of Corrections has information online for every inmate in the state of Georgia. So if you hear, for example, like I did at a Christmas party my first year of law school, that a friend of ours was in prison, you can go and look them up and see if that's true. Well, I did look the name of this person up, and he was on death row, which I hadn't heard anything about. I hadn't heard about the crime or why. All death penalty cases are murder cases, so he's convicted of murder, and it was the young man the boy, who used to look out for me in elementary school. And so, at this point I'm still in law school, and I reached out to his lawyers and asked what was going on, what the chances, what was the case about, what happened. He, as do most children who are living in children's homes, did not end up there because he had a stellar childhood, right? What I didn't know was all the ways that he'd been abused and tortured as a child, that he was homeless for most of his growing up, and that as a homeless 19-year-old, he became addicted to drugs because his mother gave him drugs. And he participated in 2 crimes that were horrible, and he confessed immediately, and he asked to plead guilty. He was not offered that as an option, and he was sentenced to death. So by the time I learned of this, his case had already been affirmed on direct appeal, and it was in state habeas. And he had, I thought, some decent claims. I mean, I didn't know what I was talking about because I was in my first year of law school, but one of his lawyers had never handled a murder case before, much less a death penalty case. His co-defendant, who was much older and who did have a criminal record, was allowed to plead guilty to a parolable life sentence. Some of his abuse didn't come out at the trial, some of his past kind of experiences. And law enforcement officers who would have testified to his immediate remorse weren't asked to testify at his trial. And that's something, juries in Georgia make the final decision about what the sentence is. And for the jury not to have heard that he immediately took responsibility and felt remorse was, a huge issue that, I honestly really thought would get relief in the courts. And he had very fine lawyers, and so I went about my work and kind of kept in touch. I did start to write to the person who's become our client, but more in kind of just a supportive, keep your head up kind of way. I should say my career really took me into non-capital work, and this is kind of important. We take all the pro se non-capital cases in the Georgia Supreme Court. I'm really interested in non-capital cases because we do have a lot of resources spent towards capital cases in Georgia. But about 4 years ago, right as I got tenure here, his lawyer approached us and asked, this is a great way to ask people for favors, by the way. You don't ask them to do all the work, you just say, hey, can you pitch in with some legal research and writing, you and your students, can you help out with this case? I may be leaving the office shortly, can you just kind of be backup in this case? And I said, sure, I'd love to be backup. That sounds about the right level of responsibility for a death case. And so we started working on this case, we started visiting. My students and I started looking into the case, but more importantly, sitting with our client, who is one of the most remarkable people I've ever met. Again, with no disrespect to the family of his victims, he takes a clearer look at his worst faults and worst moments than anyone I've ever known, which is hard to do, right? To take a hard look at horrible things that you've done. He has become an artist. He cares about other people and has been able to look out for other people in prison. He has helped bring other men in prison to church, or to, when they're low, looking out for them. And so over the years, we've accepted more and more responsibility, and we are handling his clemency case. All of his appeals have been denied. We were not successful in seeking to get his sentence overturned. Clemency in Georgia, by the way, just transfers the death sentence into a life sentence without the possibility of parole. So he'll never see life outside of prison gates. But we believe that based on his youth, his transformation in prison, his immediate remorse, even at the time of the crime. Most powerfully, many of the victims' family members support clemency. They understand the life experiences that led him to where he was. By the way, he would never use his childhood as an excuse. As his lawyers, we can kind of take a 60,000-foot view and see, gosh, with this background, and sometimes in the South we talk about living in a trailer park as kind of being a proxy for growing up and kind of having life hard. His stepfather made him and his half-brother sleep under the trailer. He was not allowed to sleep in the house. His stepfather used to drive by graveyards and say, "This is where I'm going to put you," and hold out a gun and threaten him with a gun and say, "This is where you're going to go in a few minutes. This is where I'm going to put your mom." His mother was a prostitute, and he was along for the ride while she was trying to earn money to raise her children. And he would not use that as an excuse, and he's instructed us not to use that as an excuse when we talk about his case. Asked us, not instructed. He's deferential. But we think that how could that not have informed how you handle conflict with fellow drug users, which is what his crime was, is a fight with other drug users and dealers.
So what's left is the clemency hearing. If I remember the drill, the clemency hearing is usually held just before the scheduled execution.
Right. So he's going to receive a death warrant this week. And then my team, who's here, and I have 20 days to convince the parole board to spare his life, which is a lot of begging. Lots of people think lawyers' jobs include arguing. It's a lot of begging, right? And convincing. So there are lots and lots of people who don't think that death is appropriate for him and for his crime. But as you'll learn in law school, the force of momentum is very powerful. That once a case has been passed on by one court to another court to another court, the weight of that momentum is almost impossible to undo. So what I've told the class is we're not actually trying to do something in this case, we're trying to undo something in this case. And something where the whole weight of political will and legal precedent is pushing against us. It's been a tremendous case. It's been the hardest thing I've ever worked on, but it's been the most powerful thing that I've ever worked on. And like most things in life that are meaningful, they come at a cost. We've spent a lot of time working on this. I'm getting less sleep than usual. I'm worrying about it and dreaming about it. But at the same time, I can't think of anything more important or more valuable than standing with another human being at this place and trying to save his life, help save his life, and be present to him while he faces what is not just terrifying. Nobody wants to die, but no one really wants to die with the weight of this kind of shame and rejection, right? He's not dying because it was his time. He's an otherwise healthy young person, young man, and to die feeling the rejection, the literal legal rejection by the state of Georgia that he has a right to be alive, I think is a symbolic weight that kind of compounds what he's facing in terms of fear or pain.
I'm going to turn it over to the students momentarily, but I always give people who are kind enough to come and visit with us one opportunity. If there's anything else you want to say, advice you want to give, anything you think these students should hear, I'd invite you to do that.
Can I do that right before the end of questions?
You can do that anytime you want.
Okay,
Want to turn it over to
yes, I'll do,
All
let's
right.
do questions for a bit. I've been talking a lot.
Okay. What questions do you have, Professor Gerwig? Yes, ma'am.
How do you deal with the hard losses? Like, as a person who's chosen to be empathetic and vulnerable to the plight of these people, I mean, how do you compartmentalize that?
I don't compartmentalize it. I sit with it, I feel it. When cert was denied in the case of our innocent client, the client who I believe is innocent, and that was her last chance of getting legal relief, I went to bed for a day and didn't come out of bed, and my wonderful parents took care of the boys, and I just was really sad, and I sat with it, and then, you know, I put one foot ahead of the other and came back to work. There's always a lot more work to do too. I also travel when I can, and that helps kind of get away, but I'm still thinking about it. So I don't compartmentalize. I sit with it and I feel it, but it's hard. It's really hard, and you have to set up some system for yourself. Some people can compartmentalize in the kind of span of a day. I just try to make some space for vacation and travel and get away when I can. Yeah.
This sounds a lot like the Georgia Innocence Project, and I was wondering if there's some capacity where the Habeas Project works with the Georgia Innocence Project? Yes, no, something?
Well, I used to work with the director of the Innocence Project, but the Innocence Project works strictly with DNA evidence, and we are really just working on legal claims related to the legal process. And so we collaborate, but we're not dealing really with factual innocence. We're dealing with legal innocence. Some element wasn't proven, or counsel was ineffective. We're dealing with constitutional criminal law issues, and they're dealing with, you know, the DNA on the sneakers says it was, you know, the cousin and not the defendant. So we collaborate to the extent that we're, you know, bouncing ideas off of each other, but really they have their own expertise and we have our own. I've never dealt with DNA evidence in a case. If I had a case with DNA evidence, I would send it to them, and they have sent cases to us where the DNA didn't either broke down and wasn't able to be tested, and they still thought there were legal claims. So I'd say in the broader sense there's collaboration, but we work with the same kinds of clients, but in different ways. Yes?
Can you talk about what you, to get into the class, your program, what do you want from students, and if you were interested in doing stuff like that, what would you recommend for us?
For 1Ls, keep your head down, work hard, and make it to your third year, right? So the second year is the key year, because the clinic is really just for third year law students. There's a bar rule that allows third year students to sign briefs in court under supervision, and that's where our students are working. So in the second year, as many legal writing classes as you can take. Evidence, criminal procedure. This is what we do, though, is such a niche practice. There's nothing that can, there's no class you could take where you could just walk into my class and know exactly what to do. It's really, I mean, there are just a handful of lawyers in Georgia doing what I'm doing. But if you come in prepared to work really, really hard, and I mean, these students are working through spring break of their third year, and I know that, I get that. And so, you know, you have to be prepared for that. I don't imagine we'll be taking on anything quite as emotionally and physically taxing as a death penalty case in its end stages anytime soon after this case. But you never know. So I'd say just be prepared to work really hard, because honestly, we have students in the class who have come in with varying ranges of preparation on constitutional criminal law issues. And the students in the class are not all going to be public defenders. They're scattering in lots of different directions, geographically and intellectually. But the one thing they all have in common is that they're super dedicated to our clients and very hardworking. So that's simple. Yes.
How much interaction do you and your students have with your clients throughout the course?
That's a good question. So we've actually had the most interaction with our client on death row. In a true irony, it's the easiest, death row is the easiest prison to visit in Georgia, for us at least, because it's a half an hour away, not 3.5 hours away. And the prison staff is actually very used to legal visits, and it's very easy to set up those visits, and we go and visit that client. He's also the client that we're kind of closest to. He's easy to talk to, he's friendly, he's thoughtful and open, and so he's a student, he's a client who I want my students to spend a lot of time with, because that time is so kind of transformative, and has been for now 4 classes of students. Now, if a client is in way South Georgia at some of the more remote prisons or more difficult, we have to leave. Everyone's laughing. I mean, it's an all-day, leave at 6 o'clock in the morning, return at 7 o'clock at night kind of deal, because it's so long to get there. They're harder to set up visits with. So we visit more remote clients less frequently, but we visit all of our clients. It's important, even though you're not, as an appellate lawyer, you're not required to visit clients. You're just required to represent them adequately. But I think spending time with clients is really important for students, and so we spend as much time as we can. If we can't sit with them in person, then we write a lot of letters or arrange legal telephone calls. But I think in-person visits are optimal, and it just happens to be that our death row client is the easiest to visit.
Well, it looks like it's time for your advice.
You guys get a lot of advice. I would just, this sounds so trite, but if your heart draws you to something, even if it feels hard or impossible, just make that happen. And you'll know what that is. And it might be tax, which is great, because there are lots of lawyers who don't want to do tax work. And I think the other piece is, in that passion, find a way to help others. Because whatever brought you here, and there may be students in this class who come from 5 generations of judges, and there may be students in this class where, my mother never graduated from college and was never told that she could have graduated from college, and so there's, I know there are different kind of life preparations, but whatever brought you here, you're here now, and we're in a privileged group of lawyers and future lawyers, and we can do things as lawyers that no one else can do. I can waive my bar card that costs me a lot of money, but it gets me access. It is a key to these halls of power that no one else, not doctors, not accountants, no one else has access to. And you wield that key, use that key to help other people, no matter whether you're helping them in a salaried legal services job or as a extra pro bono working for, I'm trying to think of King and Spalding or Cravath in New York City. It really is very meaningful, and it's just the right thing to do. But beyond that, I think the lawyers who work with us pro bono have a lot of fun, and it's a transformative, moving experience to be able to stand with someone from a very different life experience and use what we're learning now, what we struggled through, to help them.
Sarah, I hope you can stay for a few minutes. I know the students will have some questions individually, but join me in thanking the professor.